Okay. A few months ago, a journalist revealed that in 1996 they had done an interview with Tony Blair for the Mail on Sunday. That's the year before Blair was first elected, and Blair was seeking to reassure, as you can imagine, the right-wing press that don't worry, the left in the Labour Party, they weren't just pretending to be hidden. They were, they'd been locked up in a box and safely marginalised. And how he expressed this seemed so implausible that it never even made the final cut of the interview, which is why it's only just come out. What Blair said is this. He said, "You really don't have to worry about Jeremy Corbyn suddenly taking over." Well, here we are. 21 years on, how times change. Corbyn is now widely seen as effectively the Prime Minister in waiting after one of the biggest electoral turnarounds that probably any of us can remember. Probably this is all familiar to people, but I do think we should just take stock of some of the dimensions of what that transformation in the election was. Labour achieved its biggest increase in its vote between elections, in any election or of any party since 1945. And that's just in 2-year gap between the two elections. Labour got nearly 12.9 million votes, an increase of 3.5 million votes over 2015. And for the first time, and this really does matter if you're running an electoral party, for the first time in 20 years, Labour came out of an election with more MPs than it went into. For the first time since 1997, they gained MPs at an election. In fact, the number of votes that Labour took at the election is not just greater than, of course, what Ed Miliband got in 2015 or Gordon Brown got in 2010. It's greater than what Blair achieved when he won the general elections of 2005 and 2001. In fact, with the sole exception of that first Blair victory in 1997, you have to go right back to Harold Wilson in 1966 to find Labour getting more votes at a general election. A staggering development. There's an awful lot of superficial nonsense talked about Labour and Corbyn and so on. It's quite extraordinary how the depiction, to say this in passing, of Corbyn has changed. A couple of months ago, he was this weak leader who couldn't impose his will even on his own party. Now he's apparently a tyrant with his foot on the neck of the Labour Party. Why? Because he sacked 4 shadow cabinet ministers for defying the whip. What a bastard. He was this, unpopular, marginalised figure that no one liked. Now we're told, after his appearance at Glastonbury, that he's too popular and it's almost a messiah complex. This is nonsense. This is superficial stuff. We have to grapple a bit more seriously with understanding what has happened, and it's significant for us. Because the single most important fact about the election is this, that Labour's result under Corbyn, a left-wing leader on a left-wing manifesto, blows apart one of the most damaging and protracted myths about British society that has weighed on our shoulders for more than a generation. It blows apart the idea that Britain is basically a right-wing country. That's its real significance. The election, most immediately, was an electoral rebellion against years of endless austerity, cuts, and pay freezes. That moment when Anne Rudd turned up at the leadership debate, well, at least she turned up, and said, look at our record, and the audience openly derided it. You knew that they'd lost the argument about austerity, that something was shifting in British society. And by the way, I think it also blows apart, we should just mention this, that argument that the vote to leave the European Union last summer was automatically going to lead to a kind of carnival of reaction. That's not how it feels at the minute at all. There's a huge shift to the left that we're seeing taking place. And even more broadly than the rebellion against austerity, I think there's something more fundamental, which is that the election has struck a huge blow at really the whole neoliberal settlement that we've seen dominate British society for the last 40 years. I mean, people sometimes refer to this as a kind of Thatcher settlement of the free market, privatisation, the entrenchment of profit as the sort of key guiding principle of society. I mean, in truth, it predates Thatcher. It was really the Labour government in 1976, working with the IMF to bring in the first big cuts into the welfare state that it started. And this has dominated British society. And of course, we know that what was so damaging was the way in which the Labour Party, reaching its height under Tony Blair, accommodated to this neoliberal settlement. And it went alongside a sustained ideological attack on the notion, for example, that class was still relevant in British society, that the state could ever be more efficient than the market, that the state should intervene to curb and limit the market, and actually an ideological attack that there could be any alternative in the globalised modern economy, any idea of socialism. These were sustained ideological attacks. And particularly given the weakness of the overall level of class struggle, one of the impacts of this, it meant that the alternative ideas, left-wing ideas, class politics was marginalised in much of mainstream debate. And it cast a long shadow. And I think it had its roots in defeats at the ballot box in the 1980s, drove Labour to the right, but really that was a reflection of even deeper defeats. The great industrial confrontations of the 1980s, those defeats, above all the miners' strike, that erosion of that sense that we had a collective power to challenge things, paved the way for the rise of Blair. And what it led to was a sense, even on the left sometimes, that feeling of, yeah, there are people that agree with us, but we're really a minority, a bit beleaguered in society. That if you want to win an election, therefore, you had to appeal in the great Blairite triangulation to the middle ground, i.e. to move to the right. That there wasn't enough of us. What this election means is that millions of people can now see that they're not alone. You're not just shouting at the television in frustration, thinking everyone else believes this nonsense, but, I want to renationalise things, I want to tax the rich, but there's no real... People now think 13 million people agree with me. 13 million. And that is what's transforming people's sense of possibilities and their horizons of what feels possible in society. That is a huge gain. And by the way, alongside this sense of the left is beleaguered and the minorities, there's all those ideas that you can't defy the right-wing press. That if a Labour leader puts any radical arguments, you will be savaged by the right-wing tabloids and your position will be destroyed. Well, the Daily Mail ran 12 pages attacking Corbyn the day before the election. His vote went up by 10% from the last election. I don't even actually care if it's true because it represents a kind of symbolic truth. The report that at the Times newspaper general election party on the night of the election, that Rupert Murdoch, when he saw the exit poll that said the Tories were not going to get a majority, it was going to be a hung parliament, stormed out. That sense that we have to bow down to the power of these tabloids and the right-wing press is suddenly blown apart. This represents a huge shift in the minds of millions of people. Britain is moving to the left. I don't mean everyone, and you have to worry about what happens on the right, and it's polarised and so on, but there is a huge shift to the left that actually I would argue is continuing and even since the election because it's given such a huge boost to people. We'll talk about it more at other meetings, but look at the response to the horrific fire at Grenfell Tower. I mean, what struck me, it's Corbyn saying that empty properties should be requisitioned for people, which, my God, is so common sense. But to say it, and then there are polls that show the vast majority of people agree with it. Vast majority of Tory voters agree with it. Someone like Clive Lewis, who is a Labour MP, who's sometimes more pro-Corbyn than others, to put out that tweet where he says, burn neoliberalism, not people. I mean, this is the kind of language we haven't heard in mainstream politics. But actually what impressed me more than that was some of the responses of survivors and local residents who rallied round, who put in front of a camera, articulated an incredible level of class anger. Corbynism, the rise of Corbyn has given them a boost, and in turn I think it pushed Corbyn further to the left. This is an incredibly radical moment and a huge opportunity. And it's all the more remarkable, I think, for the obstacles that it had to overcome. the hostility of so much of the Parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, Siobhan was just reminding me that a year ago, on the Thursday of Marxism, I did a talk about Labour, which just came after the attempted coup attempt to drive out Corbyn. It also came not just in the face of the right-wing press, but so much of the liberal left press, The Guardian, The New Statesman. Again and again, Corbyn's a good guy, but he's not electable. This was the drumbeat, and that actually, I think the combination of the Parliamentary Party boosted the media stuff and is what drove Labour's polling down. As we all know, at the beginning of the campaign, April the 18th, when Theresa May announced the election, Labour was polling in the mid-20s. To overcome that in such a short space of time is an incredible and remarkable achievement. And then during the campaign itself, again, let's just remind ourselves, with two horrific terror attacks and that onslaught against Corbyn as supposedly a terrorist sympathiser, all of that stuff, which, most people might think this is going to do damage and so on. It didn't work. It didn't work. This is a remarkable set of achievements. Now, I looked over some of the media coverage. The Private Eye has an excellent little summary of all of these things, by the way. I think it's worth touching on again. I mean, you tend to say you can revel in how wrong they got it, but actually so many of them said, I'm very sorry, I made a mistake, and are now just repeating the same arguments, right? So I think it's worth reminding ourselves how the assumptions of that kind of political media commentariat were so divorced from the reality of the lives, experiences, and the ideas of millions of working class people. When the election was called in mid-May, the debate, not just on the right, but much of the liberal and left media, was how bad will it be? Will it be another 1983, which was the last time Labour stood on anything like a left-wing manifesto, the supposedly famous longest suicide note in history, which I think probably the Tory manifesto now makes a stronger claim to be. Labour got 27.6% in 1983, right? The worst results since 1918. Other commentators said, no, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. Labour's going to do much worse than that. It's going to be like the 1930s, like 1935 or 1931, the biggest electoral disaster that Labour's ever suffered since it became a mass party. So there's a guy, and we probably each have our favourite examples. There's a guy called Matthew Goodwin, who's a professor who wrote a book that some people might know called Revolt on the Right, about the rise of UKIP. He told the Sun newspaper in late April that it was entirely possible that Labour would get just 20% of the vote. 20% of the vote, so he was half right? But as I read some of the media accounts, what's remarkable is not just how pessimistic they were at the beginning, but how even as the polling, and we all thought, something's interesting happening here, and more people get more confident, and there was more energy in months later, they kept on with the same tune. A couple of examples. There's a man called Atul Hatwell, who's the editor of the Labour Uncut website, and this is on the 20th of May, right? Labour's facing a parliamentary wipeout. They'll lose 90 seats, their worst since 1935. When a poll came out putting Labour on 38%, the same Matthew Goodwin I mentioned said, that's nonsense. And he put out a tweet, which he probably regretted later, that said he'd happily eat the pages of his latest book on Brexit. Labour, of course, got 40% of the vote, and Twitter reminded him a lot. And he actually, fair play to him, although I don't know how you recover from this, he ate a page of his book on Sky News, right? Which to me sums up how wrong these people were and how little they understand what's taking place in British society. The editor of the New Statesman said, and this was on the 6th of June, 2 days before the election, it's much worse than the polls. I'm getting private reports, and he probably was, and they probably believed them. The people telling him were probably right-wing Labour MPs. It's nonsense. Labour MPs are having to defend 10,000 majorities from the Tories. It's going to be a disaster. Come on. Labour took seats like Plymouth, Portsmouth South, the first ever Labour MP, Canterbury, Tory since 1918, seats like Kensington and Battersea in London. And not just the places they took. Near where I grew up in West London, in Brentford, which was a Labour seat, had a majority of 465. It was a Tory target seat. What was the outcome? oh, Labour's majority is now 12,000, right? These people were saying Labour was going to struggle to hold 10,000 seats to majorities. Completely out of touch. What lay behind this surge? This is the crucial thing we have to understand. Now, this is not uncontested. There are debates starting to come through, and it's important that we engage in them and understand them. We will hear these arguments. One argument, which can have a superficial attraction, I heard Jess Phillips put this the other day. Exactly. She said, but you've probably heard it. Come on, it wasn't really Corbyn. It was Theresa May turned out to be utterly useless. It was her disastrous campaign. Now, it's unquestionable that Theresa May ran what's probably already regarded, and I think the history books will regard as probably the worst general election campaign possibly ever. To disown part of your own manifesto on social care, on the dimension, I mean, to disown it after you've got elected, that's normal. You tell lies, you get elected. That's to abandon it before an election is quite extraordinary. And we know about, the wooden performance, the avoidance of talking to any ordinary people, the avoidance of the debates, the bizarre stream of factory visits, something out of North Korea or something. I mean, we know all that, but still, I think it's worth saying that going into this election, I think Theresa May made two calculations. One was that, don't forget she supported Remain very quietly in the referendum, but she'd come to sort of own Brexit. And I think her idea was, beating a nationalist drum around Brexit would win over UKIP voters, including sections of the working class in the North and the Midlands and so on. Her second calculation was that Corbyn was leading Labour to the political margins and to an electoral Armageddon. Therefore, she'd get a landslide. If you're going to get a landslide, isn't it good to have, you don't need to put much in your manifesto. You can even put in sort of difficult things that you want to do, which is an attack on that part of their own social base of amongst older people, hence the dementia tax, so you can get it through the Lords and all of this stuff. She wanted to gain dominance not just over Parliament, but of course over the Tory party with its warring factions over Brexit, to have more room for manoeuvre. Therefore, you don't really talk to the rest of the party. You run highly personalised campaigns about Theresa May, and you play down the fact that it's the Conservative brand and so on. You have a very small group of advisors, so it's your personal victory. That all followed from the logic of those two calculations. I think it's important to note that the first of the calculations wasn't completely off. The Tory vote increased by 2.3 million in this election. She won a higher percentage than Thatcher did in 1987. The problem is that Labour's vote did the exact opposite of what was predicted, and that's where the problems started. In other words, it was Labour's surge under Corbyn that exposed May's failings, not the other way around. And therefore, we have to explain that surge. And the way that I would put it is very simple. I think that what Corbyn succeeded in doing in the election campaign was to put his hand on what I'd call the live rail of British politics, which is that beneath the surface, beneath the appearances that can sometimes be at the top, hidden, sometimes latent in British society, are enormous pools of bitterness, anger towards the establishment, class hatred. Enormous. And what Corbyn did is he attempted to connect with that and mobilise it. And that's what transformed all of the political calculations that I've outlined. And more than that, he gave it a class focus. I mean, right from the off, I remember my ears pricked up straight away. After May called the election, he did a press conference in which he said, if I was Southern Rail, or if I was a Philip Green, I'd be worried about a Labour government. If I was Mike Ashley, the guy from Sports Direct, appalling character, or a tax-avoiding multinational corporation, I'd want to see a Tory victory. That's quite a strong class argument. I mean, actually, even when you've heard this, to actually name names about members of the ruling class and attack them, this is quite impressive. And then, of course, the manifesto itself, I mean, whoever leaked it was a genius, because it meant it dominated the airways for even longer, and people will be familiar with it, income tax rises on the top 5%, increase corporation tax, renationalise the railways, Royal Mail, the water industry, the national electricity grid, abolish tuition fees, and so on. I think what's important to see is Corbyn didn't create this mood. What he did is he mobilised it and gave it a class focus. And this mood exists in British society. It's now much more visible. I mean, but it's interesting. The annual British Social Attitude Survey just came out, which is done every year by the government, and that the person who edited it said that, they asked questions like, do you support more increased taxes for more public spending? Do you think people on benefits, fiddle them? And so they ask all these questions. And his conclusion from it was, this guy called Roger Harding, head of public attitudes at the National Centre for Social Research, just so you know I didn't make it up, people's tolerance for austerity is drying up, even if that means higher taxes. Now, I mean, they always ask, would you be prepared personally to pay more taxes? And, of course, that's not rightly what Labour said. They said, you should have more public services and the rich should pay more tax, right? But there's a huge shift in attitude. And it's interesting, over questions like benefits, the numbers of people who think that people claim them dishonestly is at a 30-year low. The scapegoating isn't working. The scapegoating and the anger against austerity has been growing. That's what Corbyn tapped into. I think if he'd only had radical policies, that wouldn't have been enough, actually. I think the other side to it was that gradually, falteringly, but with real energy at the end, Labour's campaign wasn't just the conventional door-knocking, did you vote Labour last time, will you vote Labour this time, don't argue too much, and so on. It had a whiff of insurgency about it. With the rallies that they started to organise. And actually, this didn't start straight away. I mean, at the beginning, there were far too many invite-only events, sometimes with Corbyn doing kind of auto-cue presentations, which is not him at best. It's more stilted. He's best in front of a big crowd, as we all know. Gradually, though, they started... I mean, I think I'm right that he went to Sheffield and there were hundreds of people. But, come on, I think there were 3,000 last year in the leadership campaign. I think the turning point was when he went to Leeds. Again, only short notice, I understand, but thousands of people turned up. I looked at the date, that was 15th of May. This is a month into the campaign. But you got a sense that their confidence started to grow. And then what do we start to see? A few days later, Corbyn addressed thousands of people in West Kirby, on the Wirral, in Merseyside, on the beach. He then went famously to Prenton Park, the ground of Tranmere Rovers, where there was a gig taking place in front of the Libertines crowd. And for a 68-year-old politician, the best one in the world looks like your chemistry teacher, to step in front of a crowd of young people who've no doubt been in the bars and, there's an element of a risk here. Of course, he gets a fantastic response, and that chant about, oh, Jeremy Corbyn, suddenly took off and the rest became history. And, it culminated in that where there was notice given, when he went to Gateshead a couple of nights before the election, 10,000 people turned up. And it's that combination, I think, of the radical policies and a sense of trying to mobilise and energise your support that proved so effective and created that sense of insurgency. Second argument I want to touch on, which you also hear, is to say that Labour's vote wasn't so much just about Corbyn or the radical politics, but really about Brexit, that it was driven by a revolt of Remainers. I went, I don't know, for reasons that escape me now, I went to a New Statesman event the other night, and Clive Lewis was one of and Jess Phillips, that's where I heard her say this, was one of the speakers, and he said, look, we did really well, but it's quite a soft vote, because really it was people tactically voting against Brexit, Remainers, and therefore, it's very fragile and so on. Now, you kind of hear his argument. I think there's a number of problems with it. One is that if it was a revolt of Remainers, why not vote for a party committed to opposing Brexit and calling for another referendum, which was the Lib Dems, whose vote did not go up? Why instead vote for a party which in its manifesto accepts Brexit, voted for Article 50, and is arguing about getting the best possible terms, rightly, of Brexit? Actually, May's whole gamble was it would be the Brexit election. I mean, the Daily Mail, the day after the election was called on April the 19th, I don't know if you remember its headline, it was gung-ho, crush the saboteurs who are opposed. This is what it was supposed to be about, to galvanise support. On the whole, I think Brexit was the dog that didn't bark in the election. And it's quite interesting, if you look at Lord Ashcroft, who does he's a very rich man, so he can pay for a lot of polls. And he paid for a big exit poll, like he does after every general election. That's 15,000 people, and it doesn't ask how you're going to vote, it asks how did you just vote, and then asks you why. So it's got a degree of accuracy. Amongst Tories, it said that 48%, their main reason for voting was Brexit. It's very interesting. I mean, another 13% said the reason for voting Tory was the right leadership and the best PM. Good luck with that, is what I say. Amongst those who voted Labour, 33% said the NHS. And then if you add up those saying poverty, the economy and jobs, or spending cuts, another 22%. Of Labour voters, just 8% said their key issue was Brexit. In other words, and I think this is clear even to many of Corbyn's critics, the decision by Corbyn to accept Brexit, but to put an emphasis on an anti-austerity class campaign, proved vital in terms of how it mobilised support. Another argument I just want to touch on, there's an argument that says there's something very strange happened in this election. The traditional class allegiances suddenly reversed. So Ipsos Mori, in its post-election assessment, says the middle class has swung to Labour while the working class has swung to the Conservatives. It's a very curious argument, but it's starting to percolate in terms of some of the internal debates in the Labour Party. So it's worth just touching on. The argument really that someone like Andrew Rawnsley in The Observer's put is that Labour did well amongst the kind of middle-class, affluent professionals and amongst the very poorest, but particularly amongst skilled manual workers, what's sometimes known in the sociological as C2s, you know, the ABs, middle-class professionals, and the DEs, sort of semi-skilled, unemployed, and so on. They voted, but in the middle, the skilled manual workers voted Labour, and the Tories did better amongst those. So Tom Watson, good old Tom Watson, always loyal to Corbyn, does an interview in The Observer and says, look, we've done very well amongst the kind of young professionals, but what we now need is to worry about the traditional working class. This is the argument. What's some of the picture? Now, it's true that Labour's vote amongst, what they call the ABs, professionals supposedly, did increase by 11%. It's also true the Tory vote amongst the C2s was up 13%. Now, what do we say about this? First of all, let's be clear. The Tory vote amongst the ABs was still well ahead of Labour's by 10%. It still has that strong class feeling about it. And in part, the reason why the Tories did pick up more skilled manual worker is because of the collapse of the UKIP vote. And it made a considerable difference, although note about 6 of people who voted UKIP switched to Labour in this election. It's also interesting when you factor in age that amongst all of these categories, sociological categories, under 35, Labour led in all of them. And amongst 35 to 54-year-olds, it leads in all of them except the ABs. In other words, probably the vast majority of people at work, amongst those categories, Labour has a majority. The biggest problem is very simple. It's the idea that ABC1s are middle class and C2DEs are working class. And it rests on an idea that white-collar work, if you're not in a factory, you're not working class. And that might have been true in about 1900. But I'm sorry, the reality of 21st century capitalism is completely different. So, teachers, for example, are said to be middle-class professionals in B. I'm sorry, teachers are working class. And that's been true for a long time. And why might they have voted Labour? And actually, there's an interesting survey by the Times Educational Supplement that says there was a huge swing to Labour amongst teachers. Why? Because of the intensification of work, because of workload pressures, because of cuts in the school. It's not hard to work out. It's also not hard to work out why maybe some middle-class layers also voted like GPs. Again, there's evidence on GP Online says there was a big swing to Labour amongst GPs. Again, why? Is it sort of just No, it's what's happening inside the NHS. It'd be very interesting to see how junior doctors, I suspect there was a big swing towards Labour. Not hard to work out why that might be. This is nonsense. What's true is that clearly the Tory party has had some success in rebuilding some of its support amongst skilled manual workers, which explains why some seats like, Mansfield, Walsall, Derbyshire North East, Middlesbrough South, which some of the sort of historic mining and steel communities that have been most hit by the neoliberal restructuring of British capitalism and so on, there was still a pull towards the Tories. And the way that I'd put it is I think that what Corbyn offered is hope and anger directed towards those at the top of society. That wave it hit lots of people, it didn't quite hit everywhere. And the task is, how do you shift that? How do you win over those people? This is where I just want to touch on a couple of points to end, about the way forward. One is, there is an argument, I think we should intervene in it, which is, what's the road to a parliamentary majority for Labour? And the various sages on the right, after their brief apologies, are now learning nothing and offering advice. So I noticed that Ed Ball suddenly said that the way forward for Labour is to stop being an outsider and to become a trusted insiders. In other words, and this is the argument, it says you've done very well on the anti-austerity argument. You've got people who voted Green switching back to Labour, people who didn't vote, you've done very well. You surprised me on that, Jeremy. You've done very well. But to get over the hurdle, we have to take votes away from the Tories. And how are we going to do this? We have to reassure them. So good old Tom Watson again. We have to win traditional skilled workers. How are we going to do it? We have to give them reassurance. Reassurance on what? Policing, security, immigration. Natasha Engel, who lost her Labour seat to the Tories in Northamptonshire, it's Derbyshire North East, said we have to appeal to the white working class. This is the pressures. Now, I think there are very encouraging signs about the direction that Labour's gone. I think it's continuing to shift left under Corbyn. But the truth is, Labour's position is transformed. At the beginning of the election, it was the outsider with nothing to lose. The pressures, now that Labour looks increasingly plausible as an alternative government, the pressures to moderate will increase. It's worth recalling, when Syriza, the radical left government, again on an anti-austerity programme, not when it won, but in 2012, when it went from being 4%, 5%, to suddenly being 26%, 27%, and the government in waiting, the pressures on it grew to moderate. This would be a disaster. This would be an absolute disastrous course for Labour to take. And the Labour right, who have been weakened because their argument that Corbyn was unelectable suddenly doesn't look so plausible. Make no mistake, they've not gone away, these people, and are on manoeuvres. Suddenly there's an awful lot of talk of unity. At the Progress Blairite event last weekend, there was an awful lot of talk of unity. What they mean by unity, what they mean is there should be no attacks on the Labour right, there should be no deselections, there should be no restrictions on their room for manoeuvre, and you see Chuck Amuna on manoeuvres trying to use the question of the EU to split Labour support, or the kind of arguments which Chuck Amuna also supports, that we should be, more restrictions on immigration and so on. It's vital that Labour rejects these kind of arguments. This argument about the white working class is a crude, patronising view that somehow, manual workers are conservative bigots. This is really the argument. And our argument isn't that everybody's left-wing and so on. People have contradictory ideas. What Corbyn was able to do in the election was offer an alternative based on class politics that begins to pull people. The answer is to create an even bigger wave, an even bigger mobilisation, even further radicalisation. I'd like to see him, there were some compromises in the manifesto. The talk of getting rid of freedom movement, the acceptance of Trident. I think he should go further and get rid of those compromises. That's the way to create an even bigger majority. A couple of points to end on, because I can see the chair's getting nervous. Look, I think we've got to think about this as well, which is, during the election campaign, the main argument probably I had with a lot of people was, can Corbyn win? I'd say yes, and people, do you really think that? Discussion. There's still an argument about how we could now reach a parliamentary majority, and it's a necessary argument. But I think there is another one, which is, what would be the fate of a Corbyn government? What would it look like? How much could it, being in government, implement of its programme? And this is very, very important. How will the establishment react to a Corbyn victory? Now, I think there probably are many people who think, get into office, you can do all these things and so on. I think amongst many, many Corbynites, because of the sheer hostility of the establishment towards him, I think are very open to the argument that says that won't stop the day he gets a mandate. So there's a guy called Alex Nuns who wrote a book. It's a very good book. I can see that we've got it here, actually, the Candidate, about Corbyn's rise to Labour leadership. It's a very, very perceptive book. He's a big Corbyn supporter. He did an interview in the US left-wing magazine Jacobin recently, which he says, look, Corbyn will face huge challenges. A Labour Party that actually challenges its entrenched power and governs for the broad mass of people will face significant resistance. If we got into government, the movement behind the Labour Party and Corbyn would have to step up and exert itself in society. You can't just leave it to someone in number 10 to implement your programme. That's not going to work. Another article on one of these kind of new pro-Corbyn blogs, the New Socialist blog, went further and talked about the threat of capital flight, investment strikes, foreign exchange crises, trade retaliation. This is correct. And all the historical record points to it. That means that you have to go beyond electoralism. If getting into office is not enough, then elections are not enough. A radical left Labour government under Corbyn, with ministers sitting at the top, of the Treasury and so on, will actually be in hostile territory, surrounded by the unelected powers of the senior civil service, the judges, the police, the army, the boardrooms, the banks, and so on. And they're going to look to try to undermine, constrain, if necessary, break a Corbyn government. Let me just give you one example. Corbyn sometimes has this excellent argument where he says we have to renationalise the NHS, kick out the outsourcing companies that have warrened the health service. And they're not small family firms. I mean, there's a strike this week at Bart's Hospital amongst the workers of Serco. These are giant companies. They are not just going to let him shut off a huge supply of profits without resistance. And this will be across British capitalism. Therefore, we have to learn the lessons. We have to learn the lessons not just of what happened to Syriza in Greece, where it was crushed, and people say, but Britain's much richer than Greece, isn't it? But look at France. Very, very similar. Top of the, advanced capitalist country, hugely wealthy. Francois Hollande promising to tax the rich more than John McDonnell, 75%, and so on. Again, faced this onslaught, compromised, retreated, and has now crumbled, and the Socialist Party is more or less disintegrating. My point is not this is inevitable. My point is that it will take mass resistance and class confrontations in response, that the extra parliamentary battle will in the end be decisive, that it's absolutely right that an electoral moment has created huge opportunities for the British left. Although the movements against war, austerity, racism in the 2000s, that sense of insurgency in the general election campaign, that sense of a movement has fed into that. But to capitalise on this opportunity, to strengthen it, to drive out the Tories, to push Corbyn into office, and then to build a movement that's capable of resisting the onslaught by British capitalism onto it, these things will be decided not in parliamentary majorities, but in terms of mass movements. And within that, clarity about where their power lies, where the real ruling class power lies, not in government, but in these unelected hierarchies in the state machine and in the economy, and where our power lies in collective resistance on the streets and, yes, in the workplaces, will be absolutely decisive, preparing for that battles to come.
Ian, is this on? Yeah. Ian Ferguson, Glasgow SWP. Another casualty, comrades, of the election result was a belief that's been prevalent on the Scottish left for a very long time, but probably to some extent in the English left as well, which is the idea that people in Scotland are somehow innately, genetically more left-wing, more progressive than people south of the border. And it's an idea that was kind of blown out of the water because, although Martin didn't mention it, you will have noticed that one part of the UK did not obviously swing to the left during the election, that was Scotland. We went from having 1 Tory MP to 13 Tory MPs. The Labour vote did increase, but only to about 7 MPs. And most dramatically, the SNP lost a third of their MPs. And I think essentially there are 3 reasons for that. First of all is that the Scottish referendum vote 3 years ago was not primarily a nationalist vote. It wasn't because people in Scotland were more left-wing, but essentially because, in exactly the same way that Mark has described, people were hungry for change, for a different kind of society. When we canvassed in some of the poorest areas in Glasgow, young lone parents would say, do you think it's possible? Do you think things can change? Do you think we have a different future for my kids? So it wasn't about some nationalist thing. And actually we argued, quite alone almost in the left in Scotland at that time, that actually the mood in Scotland was no different from the mood south of the border. What was different in Scotland was there appeared to be a vehicle, the SNP, that could actually give a voice to that. Second point in that is, precisely, it is the failure of the SNP to give a voice to that anger and that discontent that has led to them losing so many votes. This is an SNP government which uses left rhetoric, but wherever SNP councils are in control, they have actually brutalised services, imposed austerity in exactly the same way as Labour councils have. And finally, the third aspect of it is the total failure of the Scottish Labour Party to offer any alternative. Kezia Dugdale, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, actually argued that in some areas you might be better to vote Tory to keep the SNP out, because the main enemy was not the Tories, was not austerity, was the SNP, was independence. So in that situation, it's scarcely surprising that the Labour vote did not increase massively. Just 2 final points. Insofar as it did increase, I have no doubt that the reason for that was the beginnings, a belated beginning of a Corbyn bounce, a Corbyn effect in Scotland. That is beginning to happen. It'll be very interesting to see how that develops. Just a final point is this, and it touches Mark's final points too. I was at a CWU meeting yesterday. The CWU postal workers have come under massive attack by their bosses, short-term contracts, massive attacks on their conditions. We spoke there to a CWU rep who came over and said, can you give me the email for socialist worker? Because when I've got into this meeting, I want to send down a report. He said, but we're really excited with this. For the first time ever, we have a Labour leader who's going to support our strike. Isn't that wonderful? I think that mood is probably reflected across tens of thousands of workers. And I think if Corbyn actually continues to give that kind of support, then we can see that political mood changing into an industrial mood that can really shake the ruling class and the Tories.
After this speaker will be the comrade from the end with the sunglasses. Yeah.
Hi there, everyone. First, I'd like to start by saying thank you for your very insightful lecture. It was really...
Use the microphone. Yeah, just lean forward ever so slightly.
Thanks to Mark for his very insightful lecture. He made some really interesting and original points. I wanted to both make a point and also ask a question both to Mark and to the audience in general, which is that, I don't know, lots of you may have seen the interview that Owen Jones did in The Guardian with Frankie Boyle, where Frankie Boyle was asked, how does capitalism going forward and how does the Conservative Party going forward manage its crisis and itself? And he said that we mustn't forget that these people, the upper echelons of the capitalist ruling class and of the Conservative Party, are disaster capitalists, and so they will manage a situation even if they are in some way hamstrung at present. They will manage it going forward. And so my question and the point I wanted to make is that many people are talking about who will replace Theresa May, and we've got all these awful alternatives, for example, on the front bench. But picking up on the point that the gentleman from Scotland was making was that there's one leader that people haven't been talking about in the Conservative upper ranks, which is Ruth Davidson, for example, someone who can pose as a respectable, kind face for the Conservative Party, start to offer concessions like rolling back things like the public sector pay cap, easing austerity measures. For example, if you see Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General who David Cameron sacked, has already started to talk. There are already people in the Conservative Party starting to talk about rolling back austerity, and there's the real danger, it seems to me, that this narrative might again be weaponised in order to make the Tory party a serious electoral force and roll back some of the gains that Labour have made. And so what I wanted to know, is there not a real danger that the Conservatives identify someone, not like Boris Johnson, a buffoon, or Michael Gove or anything like that, but someone who can look more like a one-nation Conservative, or at least poses that, in order to try and undo the electoral gains that we've so amazingly achieved so far?
After this speaker will be the comrade in the striped shirt in the fifth row. Yeah.
Hi, just a question for Mark, really. I have quite a lot of friends who are Conservative and lots of family who are Conservative, and probably the few people who are not are people who don't really want to vote, and they're all spoil your vote, you know, because why would you want to give power to the politics, blah, blah, blah. So, for example, I was out for tea the other night and I was just mentioned Jeremy Corbyn's name, and my uncle pounces on me and he's like, oh, well, yes, he's just been humiliated, hasn't he, by, I nearly said Margaret Thatcher then, you know, the Conservatives, by humiliating himself, talking about austerity and that being to blame for the fires in London because of the cladding, and that was done under Tony Blair's rule, da-da-da. So I didn't really know what to say to that because I feel like I'm very passionate about Labour, and of course, to me, I don't really need a big, intelligent conversation about it because I feel like it's just obvious that you should support the masses and not the few, blah, blah, blah. But I just thought, do you have an answer, like maybe a 2-minute summary or a 1-minute summary that you can fire to these people who are very ignorant and they just, you know, because they're just, you know, just a 1-minute, 2-minute thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After this speaker will be in the glasses at the end of the row. I think you've got a red something. Yeah, you.
I've just met a comrade today sitting next to me whose thesis is studying nationalisation in Britain. And yesterday I made a statement. I said that, you know, under EU rules, the nationalisation, renationalisation of Royal Mail and the nationalisation of Southern Rail would not be possible, would not be permitted. I just want to find out if that is true, you know, that statement I made. And then a second suggestion to comrades, because I read in Socialist Worker that the Unison Conference was a little bit dour. I suggest to comrades, you should all say, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn," when he's there. At every union conference, and I think we can really take a lead and really give a spirit, obviously when Jeremy Corbyn's there. And then just two other observations, which I've read from The Guardian. The first is that the cladding, all the tests, the fire-resistant cladding and the non-fire-resistant cladding were all permitted under EU regulations. And then finally, yesterday, or possibly this morning, I've read that there has been an amnesty for illegal migrants from Grenfell Tower, correctly, completely, and I don't believe that has got anything to do with EU regulations. So it's actually about, how things move to the left, class struggle, so on and so forth.
Next will be, you.
I'm a local government worker and quite desperate for change because austerity, I'm working social care and it's really kicking in. There's a lot of desperate people out there. So on the one hand, we get the fantastic result from the election, but on the other hand, we get a constant dismal responses from Unison nationally and locally in terms of our conditions being under attack. I've had decades and decades where my union leadership has been put under pressure and given by Labour leaders who basically is saying keep the troops down, keep them. We want a Labour government. We don't want strikes on our watch. We believe in austerity. So Labour leaders do have that relationship with trade union leaders at a time. So what I want to see is whether Corbyn will actually not just kind of like support strikes, but actually see that for him to win and for there to be an anti-austerity Labour government, not a right-wing one, he needs to encourage workers' action, really. And I know after the election, John McDonnell did say something like that. And when I heard about the election result, I did think, right, now he really needs to call on people, to get involved in industrial action and that. And I know as a revolutionary, I know that, you can't have a Jesus figure calling on the union leaders to support strikes and everything's hunky-dory. The pressure has to come from below. But I'm not sure if Corbyn always understands about, in terms of where the power is, really, to really push things through. Okay.
Okay, after this speaker, we'll have the comrade in the striped top with the blue shirt on, second from the end. This is no reflection at all on anyone who's spoken so far. You've been all very disciplined. I should have said at the beginning, we'll keep contributions to 3 minutes so we can get as many people in as possible.
Simon Hester from Haringey, SWP branch. I think it's important that what Mark said, the key things were, we were right, that there's a massive mood of anti-austerity and anti-racism and the anti-war movements, arguments winning through in the response to the horrific attack in Manchester particularly. We were right about the Brexit vote. It wasn't just a right-wing reactionary vote. There was, as Diane Abbott said, a howl of rage against the establishment. And we were right when the election was called. We were right when we said Corbyn could win. I mean, there were Labour Party members I'm working with in various campaigns who were saying, that's what I love about the SWP, you're always so optimistic. But the optimism is based on trying to figure out what is going on inside the class, and how things are shaping up based on the consciousness of people around us and the campaigns and the movements that we're involved in. Personally, I think the turning point in this election campaign came, and I judge this based on street campaigning during the election, was around the week of the manifesto launch and the dementia tax, which came very close together. And that weekend, suddenly the mood on the streets changed very dramatically. And instead of having Labour Party members coming up to us in a state of despair, we had Labour Party members suddenly up and ready for a fight, and many other people as well. The key now is channeling the hope that Mark talked about into struggle, whether it's over the pay cap, whether it's over housing, over racism, over Trump's visit possibly in a few days' time. Because the Tory crisis, to answer the question I asked earlier, the Tory crisis is very, very deep and it will continue. They're split over Brexit. And every time there's a bit of negotiation, there'll be another split over Brexit. They've all got their red lines and they're going to fight like cats and dogs to maintain their position within the Tory party. They're now split over austerity. How far can they push it? They are split, they're falling apart, and if Jeremy Corbyn and the leadership of the Labour Party limit their approach to parliamentary manoeuvring and getting motions through Parliament and PMQs, they will be able to stabilise. They will come across as a stable force of government. The key now is channeling the hope into struggle on the outside. A couple of examples. On Monday evening, we had a march in Haringey against a Labour council which is attempting to carry out mass privatisation and social cleansing of council housing and working class people in Tottenham. The people who organised that march were some of us, but lots of Corbynistas and lots of Labour Party members who are fighting their own Labour council, their people in the Labour Party. They're enraged at the situation. Socialists now have to be working with all the people on the left, the Corbynistas in particular, Labour Party members in particular. We walk hand in hand with them in the struggle now as it goes forward. We're going to be putting pressure on Corbyn to say something about what's happening in Haringey and to stop burying his head in the sand. We need to take the right-wing Labour people on in the councils and in the Parliamentary Labour Party, and the key to that is boosting the level of struggle. So I'm all in favour of Jesus-type figures calling for more struggle. If they do that, brilliant, because that's what we need. We need people to have the confidence to go to the streets, to go on strike, to follow what the Barts hospital workers are doing this week. We need to build the level of struggle to shift the thing and to push Corbyn to do the thing that he really does want to do.
Okay, we'll have the comrade at the end. Yeah, you... Next, and then the comrade right at the back in the purple.
Comrades, about the Labour Party. There was a government minister in the 1945 Labour government who said, your opponents are in the other party, your enemies are in your own party. What is different? What is different? Now, in our tradition, certainly my tradition, I hope it's in your tradition, comrades, that is the Leninist tradition, we are extremely sceptical, to put it mildly, of parliamentary socialism. What did we hear from anybody in the Labour Party in the last general election that was a challenge to parliamentary socialism? These people are left social reformists. They are not going to lead, create or support a struggle to change capitalist society. They haven't done so for 100 years, and they won't start doing it because of what's just happened. Excessive support, rather than critical support, is extremely dangerous. People are being asked to believe that the Corbynista movement, the Labour Party, electing people to Parliament, is a way of changing our society. And, oh, by the way, we'll face all sorts of opposition from the police, the military, the judges. Well, the Bolsheviks had a way of dealing with those people. Tear down the institutions that give them the power, the institutions that give them the power that they will use to frustrate. We need to abolish the judiciary. We need to abolish the police. We need to abolish the military. We need to abolish you name them, the institutions of our society, and rebuild a workers' democracy. To achieve that requires sharp political differences from the Labour Party.
Stan Keeble, Labour Party Marxists. I agree with most of what the speaker said, and it's a very optimistic moment, isn't it? In respect of the last speaker, the book that we're studying in the Labour Party Marxists at the moment is called Lenin's Electoral Strategy. And this is August Nymph, a United States academic. And he's going over the details of the extremely important role that the involvement of Bolsheviks in the Tsar's very limited parliamentary democracy that was begun after the 1905 revolution. This was crucial in winning hegemony for the Bolsheviks in 1917. That the electoral strategy was vital part of the thing. I would say today, in Britain today, the focus of the class struggle is inside the Labour Party at the moment. We've got an opportunity which is accidental, where the so-called morons put Jeremy on the ballot paper for leader, and they made a big mistake. They thought we were going to get thrashed, and they've got the opposite. They were going to teach the left the lesson, weren't they? So we can now go back. I want to go back a little bit more to the past then. Keir Hardie spoke about the Labour Party as, we must build a great mass movement for socialism. In other words, not just electoral politics, but a movement that goes into all parts of the working class. And we can do that. We can still do that. My experience of your comrades in the SWP over recent years or maybe decades is to say joining the Labour Party is a cul-de-sac. It will swallow up well-meaning left-wingers and lead them up the garden path to a dead end. But my view is that there's no reason why we should lose. When the Labour Party joined in the international, the Second International, the Socialist International, in 1908, it was moved by Karl Kautsky and seconded by Lenin. And the word was that forming the Labour Party was, although it's a federal party and so on, though it's shat from the bowels of the trade unions, as Tony Cliff said, the trade union bureaucracy, I should say, nevertheless, it's a big step forward. And there's no reason why we shouldn't win it. I don't believe it can be the absolutely necessary revolutionary party, which is an individual membership question. This is affiliated organisations, and it's a question of why don't we have all the socialist groups affiliated too, including the SWP.
Thank you. After this speaker will be the comrades in the middle with the glasses and the long earrings. Yeah.
Well, we've just had two contributions. One which said basically kind of sod the Labour Party because it's all wrong about the question of the nature of the state. And then we've just had an argument that really we should all be in the Labour Party in order to bring about change. Now, what I think is happening is that there is this huge generational shift of people who are looking to the Labour Party under Corbyn in order to bring about the change that they want to see. They want an end to austerity. They want some sort of socialist society the way it's articulated by Corbyn. They want change, right? And if you think back, 1905 started with a demonstration led by a religious leader, Father Gapon. And at the moment, people are marching behind Corbyn and the Labour Party looking for socialism to come that way. Now, I don't actually believe...
Please don't heckle. Don't heckle.
I don't actually think that class struggle is taking place inside the Labour Party. I think the reflection of the aspirations of people for change is coming through the Labour Party at the present point in time. And I therefore think, what Simon was talking about, that, and what Ian pointed to, is that actually the sheer leap forward which we've seen in the last election can empower people in taking forward more struggle. I don't think the response to the Grenfell Tower fire would have been as lively and as determined as it has been without actually the Corbyn victory. The people who went through that awful tragedy felt empowered to actually begin to do something about it in terms of protesting and storming the council chambers. And hopefully it will feed more through that. And the demonstrations we've seen, the assembly demonstration last Saturday, all of those things we actually have to be involved in. I called a meeting with, just basically with posters in lifts in 3 tower blocks, and 150 residents actually turned up because actually they want to do something about safety on their, on our estate where we in actual fact lived. And so we do have to engage in every point possible in struggling with people in order to move it forward, because we do need the movement on the streets and we do need actually to build on the class struggle. But there is a question that I actually want to raise, Mark. And that is this. I think there is an element that you missed out in terms of why Corbyn was successful. And that is the way in which the supporters of Momentum and thousands beyond that were mobilised through the Momentum campaign. Actually, what is impressive is when you find out that there are 1,000 people were going out on the knocker. And they weren't just going out on the knocker in the old way to say yes or no, but For example, Ilford North, the Wes treating types
Can you sum
said,
up, please?
you're not, okay, I'll just finish the point. You're not voting for Corbyn, you're voting for me. Whereas actually the Momentum supporters who were actually were trained to challenge those arguments and to begin to say there is an alternative being presented in the manifesto, and anyway, what's your problem with Corbyn? And actually we have to discuss how we engage with those people when they see being out on the knocker the most important thing to do. And that is a question I think we also have to address as revolutionaries.
Our final speaker after this one, before Mark comes back, will be the comrades on the end of the row behind the man in the black T-shirt. Yeah.
Cheers. Karen Reisman from Manchester. Somebody mentioned Unison Conference earlier, and I was at Unison Conference, and Jeremy Corbyn spoke on the last day, the Friday, and there was huge excitement throughout the week. And in fact, on the morning when he was due to speak at 11 o'clock, we had to stop the debate at 10:30 because people were so excited that they couldn't concentrate. Honestly, it's true, and we did sort of Mexican waves and other such, Jeremy Corbyn stuff. And I think it was interesting because he spoke inside the conference in a much more muted way than he did to the crowd of people from Brighton who'd heard he was coming, and there was between 500 and 1,000 people outside who wanted to hear him, who he was much more sort of, militant and radical with, whereas he was, and you could see that he'd okayed his conversations with the leaders of Unison, and I think that tells us something about the pressures that he's under. But I think the other thing about Unison was that most of Unison's sort of, branch secretaries and activists have been managing the cuts, managing reorganisations, managing downgradings and disciplinaries and sickness and all the other shite that we do, rather than fighting it for a large part of our trade union time. And what you got in the conference for the week before he came and afterwards was a whole series of speeches. I've never seen so many people in tears with people around them saying, oh God, that's terrible. And it was terrible. I'm not taking the piss. But not in a sense of sort of, we can do something about it, but about isn't this terrible and we'll get Jeremy Corbyn. And I think there's some level of passivism about the ultimate sort of electoralism about doing it for him. But at the same time as that, I also think that it shifts the fact that he got elected. So the fact that, Prentice had to come and support the demonstration on Saturday, the fact that he's talking about more, the fact that they're talking about having to have a pay campaign. I was at a union meeting with some members this morning who would never have been in dispute had Jeremy Corbyn and the election not taken place over a tiny reorganisation in an elderly CMHT, who actually were quite open to going out and campaigning. And actually, if we want to win those last group of people in order to get Labour over the line, we have to do that sort of campaigning to save community mental health teams and services for people with dementia. And that will not only get people over the line, but it helps when they do get over the line to actually mean that they implement some of what we do because there's that organisation. And that is a damn sight easier given Labour. So anyone who writes off Corbyn and what's happened is living in cloud cuckoo land because of the impact it has on the ground is massive.
This is our last speaker in the discussion. I'm sorry if you raised your hand and I didn't have the opportunity to call you. There were lots of contributions.
Charlie Kimber, the editor of Socialist Worker. Coming back to the comrade who spoke a few people ago, the worst possible thing you could say at the moment is Labour, nothing has changed. The worst possible thing. The worst possible thing is to say of Social Democrats before, Social Democrats now, absolutely nothing has altered. Because things have altered. Millions of people in Britain now believe the left can win. And it's very, very important. Millions of people now think that socialism is something we should be discussing and seeking to achieve. That's very, very important. As Karen said, if Corbyn had been crushed in the election, there would not be any pay campaign going on. I don't know whether there'll be a pay campaign. The trade union leaders will try and prevent it breaking through. But nonetheless, there's the possibility of that happening now. And the surge of confidence that millions of working class people have is the key to achieving the sorts of mobilisations which can go beyond the agenda of Corbyn and the Labour Party. And the reason is that why that is important is because, as Mark said, we have to begin preparing and organising for the possibility, or perhaps now the probability, of a Corbyn government. Because the record is there. And we don't put forward the record in order to demobilise people. We put the record there to say you have to look at this and prevent the same thing happening. François Hollande did not campaign as a sclerotic right-winger. François Hollande campaigned, as famous phrase, I am the enemy of finance. Within 6 months, he was the pawn of finance, having become the president. Alexis Tsipras did not campaign to tear gas pensioners in Syntagma Square, to implement a worse austerity programme than that of his Conservative predecessor, or to round up refugees and threaten to deport them to the tender mercies of the Erdogan regime in Turkey. He campaigned as the enemy of austerity, and they were broken by the unaccountable power of the bosses and the bankers. That's not to say, I've seen this film before, the same thing will happen if you're wasting your time. The point is to say we have to mobilise now to ensure that there is a power outside Parliament and a different sort of organisation which can prevent, when Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, the same result being that of Hollande or Tsipras and Syriza. And at this moment, Corbyn has a huge responsibility. Actually, Corbyn is more important than the trade union leaders at the moment. If Corbyn said, I want to struggle against the pay cap, it would be more significant than Dave Prentice saying it. If he said, I'm going to have mass rallies against the pay cap, it would be more important than Len McCluskey having rallies against the pay cap. If Corbyn said now, I'm going to Manchester on the 1st of October for a demonstration outside the Tory party conference, and I want everyone to be there, it would be a massive demonstration.
Can you sum up,
If
please?
Corbyn had said 2 days after Grenfell, and for thousands of people in Britain, there is a before Grenfell and an after Grenfell moment, a deep anger in British society. If Corbyn had said, I want 20,000 on the streets of London, in 2 days' time, he would have got it and more.
Can you sum up, please?
And we need a party that focuses on struggle, mobilisation, resistance in the streets and the workplaces, not on Parliament.
So, Mark's going to come back to sum up. Thank you.
I'm just trying to address some of the questions. First of all, the comrade who asked about could the Tories recover their position through retreating on austerity and perhaps sort of a more liberal leader. I mean, first of all, I don't think it's that easy for the Tories. I mean, for example, is it that easy to retreat on austerity? I noticed that May and Hammond are now coming down and saying they're not going to retreat on the pay cap. So it's not clear that without a huge fight inside the Tory party that's even going to happen, and a huge fight has risks for them. Secondly, to retreat on austerity is essentially to say we agree with Labour. Well, what's the point of voting Tory then? It moves on to Labour's terrain, ideologically. This is very dangerous for them. It could actually strengthen Labour. Secondly, a one-nation Tory who presumably would also be inclined to try to stay in the EU risks Theresa May has completely broken her authority. She's sitting on top of the kind of warring factions of the Tory party. The danger is a shift one way or another and the war would erupt, and there's no necessary reason they'd be able to keep control of that, and the feared next election could become a lot closer. Now, that's not to say you can rule out the Tories recovering. What I'd say is, it's not that, I'll tell you what the danger is. For so long, it seemed like the other side were in charge, that we think they can always manoeuvre and so on, and there's nothing. The truth is, whether they recover, I think, is now in our hands. Because if we do nothing, if we let the radical moment go, if those pressures to moderate the message, if more business reaches out to Corbyn, let's work together, and keeping in a single market, you can see how these things can happen. That would be a disaster. That's what would allow the Tories to recover. If, however, we respond and say, let's deepen this radical moment, that means that Corbyn shouldn't retreat, but also we have to translate that into change on the ground, on the streets and the workplaces. You limit the Tories party from mover, and you maximise your advantage. In other words, you have to seize the moment. It's a subjective question, not just our fate that they'll always recover. Second question about the comrade who talked about arguments for people, in her family, and I can share some of the, share your pain. I know, we've all been there. And what's my 2-minute answer on that one? It says Blair was as bad as the Tories. Is yes, he was. But Corbyn is precisely a rebellion against the whole spirit of Blair's embrace of the market and privatisation. And actually, the more radical Blair is, the more he distances himself from the establishment, the more he shows, and I still think there are people out there who said, Labour, Tory, they're still the same, and so on, even though first election for decades where it actually felt there was a difference. There's such as a level of alienation, disconnect, and despair in some areas of the country that message, if you like, of hope and an alternative still hasn't reached, and therefore the more radical Corbyn is, and if that's backed by a bigger mass movement behind it, the more it can show there's a real alternative and it's not just business as usual. On the EU, I think it's fair to say that the membership of the EU and the single market would certainly place huge obstacles and certainly open the door to many, many legal challenges to things like renationalisation of the railways, whether it completely rules it out or not. It'd be much, much harder. This is an important debate because people still disagree about this. There are still people who want to stay in the EU, there are people that want to leave, and so on. And it was a huge split inside the left, a very damaging split in many ways. I'm for patient debate about it, and I think that one of the things we should say to people, if you agree with Corbyn's programme, you have to ask how much of that programme would survive continued membership of the single market. And the truth is that neoliberalism is built into the very nature of the single market. But actually, is our choice, I mean, this is the, the whole hard Brexit, soft Brexit. Really what we're being presented with is you can either have neoliberalism inside the EU or neoliberalism outside the EU. What was good, what was fantastic about Corbyn is he began to see in the general election campaign an argument put in front not of small audiences but millions of people, this is the point about the election campaign, that said there can be an alternative to neoliberalism. I would argue carrying through the logic of that means breaking from the single market, not to retreat into a kind of siege economy. Actually, that would be a huge beacon to people right across Europe who've been under the cosh of the Troika and the attacks of the European Union. It would create a huge radicalising moment, far beyond the excitement we all felt around Syriza. It would electrify the left and the movements in America and so on by taking that step. So I'm for continued argument about that. I think the question of taking the spirit of Corbynism into the workplace is one of the most challenging and important that we face. I'm going to put it like this. There are currently 6.2 million members of trade unions in Britain. It's gone down in the last year. There are 12.9 million people just voted for the most left-wing leader and left-wing Labour manifesto we've seen in decades. That means at least, even if every single trade unionist voted for Corbyn, which probably isn't the case, that means 7 million people voted for that, but are not in trade unions. Think about the potential. Think about the potential if there was a real fight, if there was a real attempt to transform the level of class struggle. What do the unions worry about? Declining membership, lack of engagement. Can we get young people? Well, we've just seen the possibilities of all around this. Think about what we saw at Glastonbury and so on. In other words, when there's a vision, when there's a fight, when there's a mobilisation, you can transform your organisations. The biggest danger is what the union leaders say is, how do we get rid of the pay cap? Well, we're quite close to a Labour government. How do we get rid of the trade union laws? We're quite close to a Labour government. Wait for Labour. This is what we have to fight against. We have to grab that political mood and drive it into the workplace with an argument that says we can drive out the Tories, that's the best way to get Corbyn in, but it also prepares us for the struggles that will come if we have a Corbyn government. Last kind of point, really about how, if you like, revolutionaries should relate to the Labour Party, because I disagree that you can enter the Labour Party and turn it into a revolutionary party. Time to do, there's something called the trade union bureaucracy. The trade union leaderships, who historically have always been a very powerful force still, Unite, McCluskey and all, they're still very important figures in the Labour Party, that whole social layer. And, usually they've been a block to the left. They got so alienated from Blair, they now want a government more sympathetic to its interests, and he's now convinced them he's potentially electable. But there's a limit. These people will not allow the Labour Party to become a revolutionary party, which would be a direct challenge to their own social interests. So I think there's a limit to how much you can shift Labour to the left. Equally, the whole point of the Labour Party is to seek government office. That's the point of Labour. It's a parliamentary party. It's flexible about all things except that. The problem is we have a fundamental disagreement. We do not think that ruling class power lies in 10 Downing Street. It's only one small aspect, a kind of outer trench. Behind it, all the trenches of state and economic power that I talked about earlier, and therefore we have a fundamentally different perspective. However, I think the argument that says what you have to do at the minute is sharply differentiate yourself from Labour because people have illusions that a Corbyn government can get change, I think is a mistake because I don't think it gives any historical context. I'll tell you why. Because I think what has changed is the idea that people think you can get change. That's what's taken a huge blow. That idea that nothing will ever change, the left is a minority, most people believe the Sun, most people believe the Daily Mail, we're isolated, we have to have our heads down, lower our horizons and so on, has just taken a huge blow. There's a sense that things can change, which is why there's a sense of possibilities in the situation. Revolutionary socialists have to identify with that mood. They have to be in solidarity with it. And they have to take sides. They have to take sides with Corbyn against the right. And not just in words, but in practice. That means, you have to attack the right, you have to be on the streets, you have to be attempting to mobilise, defending Corbyn, and so on. But we also want, whilst we're in the same trench with people, and I think Sheila's absolutely right to say what we're seeing emerging is a much bigger there's been many people on the left, but hasn't been a bigger organised left. You see momentum and beginning to emerge as a serious force. On Saturday's People's Assembly demonstration, for instance, there was a whole number of momentum banners, some clearly newly made. There's a bigger organised left. This is a huge step forward in many ways. We want to work alongside people, against the right, against the establishment, but having a fraternal debate that says the heart of ruling class power does not lie in office, and that the fate of a Labour government will not be decided by parliamentary arithmetic, but by the clash of extra parliamentary forces, and you have to do everything you can to strengthen and mobilise those forces, both to get Corbyn into office, but I think Corbyn could probably get into office without mass strikes. It would be a huge step. But I tell you, to resist the establishment and its onslaught that would have tried to break and constrain that government, you will need a much bigger movement on the streets and crucially in the workplace.